Carl Schmitt. Alright, let's break down Carl Schmitt's heavy philosophical work into something entertaining and understandable. First, let's define what's on our menu. Context: Schmitt wrote during a tumultuous time in the Weimar Republic, think Germany post-World War I, economic chaos, political unrest, and rising extremism. Schmitt was a political philosopher who thought liberal democracy was a bit fluffy and ineffective for managing deep conflicts. Key works: the focus here is his idea of the concept of the political, where he asks, what's at the heart of politics? Spoiler, it's not just debating budgets in parliament. Schmitt's main dish, the friend-enemy distinction. Imagine politics as like an epic sports rivalry, say Yankees versus Red Sox or Hogwarts versus Voldemort. Schmitt claims that politics boils down to identifying who's us, the friends, and who's them, the enemies. Why does this matter? Because the stakes aren't just about winning a trophy, they're about survival, identity, and existential threats. If you're not willing to defend your way of life, are you even playing the game? Decisionism, the power of who decides. Think of a moment in your favorite action movie. There's chaos, the world's about to end, and the hero has to decide whether to cut the red wire or the blue wire. Schmitt argues that politics often comes down to decision-making in extreme situations. Who gets to decide what's right or who the enemy is? Typically, it's the state or sovereign authority. If there's no one to make these calls, society risks becoming a headless chicken. Critique of liberalism: fluffy, too idealistic? Schmitt wasn't a fan of liberal democracy because it tries to avoid conflict. He thought its love for endless debate and universal values, like human rights, blurred the real political question: who's in and who's out? To him, liberalism tries to neutralize politics, turning it into endless tea-time discussions. This avoidance, he believed, ignored how power and survival actually work. Polemic style: why so dramatic? Schmitt's writing isn't just academic, it's like an intellectual boxing match. He argued that terms like state or sovereignty are weapons in ideological battles. They only make sense if you know who they're fighting or defending against. Implications: is conflict inevitable? Schmitt argues that a world without friend-enemy distinctions isn't realistic, or even desirable. A world fully united under peace and universal values might sound nice, but Schmitt thought it would just erase politics altogether, leaving us with boring administration and Netflix debates. Let me know if you'd like me to spice up or clarify any part of this summary further. 4-0. You said. Thank you. That's a bit brief though. Could you really explain to me extensively what was discussed in the lecture of which I uploaded the PowerPoint slides in a PDF document? ChatGPT said. ChatGPT. Got it. Let's deep dive into Carl Schmitt's philosophy based on the lecture you uploaded, with lots of colorful analogies and engaging explanations. Who is Carl Schmitt and why should we care? Imagine someone who thinks democracy and liberalism are a dysfunctional couple trying to manage a dinner party. That's Schmitt. Born in 1888 in Germany, he lived through the volatile Weimar Republic, where fascists and communists threw political grenades at each other while liberal Democrats looked like deer in headlights. Key highlights of Schmitt's life. The Weimar Republic, 1918 to 1933. Schmitt defended the idea of a strong presidency. Think I can handle this chaos, give me all the power. Nazi era, 1933 to 1945. He became a legal theorist for the Nazis but fell out of favor after 1936. His legacy? A mix of political genius and ethical controversy. Today, his work inspires debates on everything from authoritarianism to the pitfalls of liberal democracy. What's the crisis in parliamentary democracy? Schmitt saw liberal democracy as a house built on quicksand. Why? Because it tries to mix two inherently contradictory ideals. Democracy, power to the people. But not all people, just the ones in the same group or homogeneous community. Liberalism, open debate, rights for everyone, and moral universality. Schmitt's problem. Liberal democracy loves procedures, like elections and debates, but ignores the messy, emotional, and existential roots of politics. For Schmitt, real democracy means knowing who's us and who's them, and sometimes, them must be excluded to protect us. What is the political? Forget about boring parliamentary debates or running government offices. Schmitt believed the political is the essence of what makes a society tick. It's not about taxes or policy, it's about survival and identity. The friend-enemy distinction. Here's the heart of Schmitt's theory. Friends, people who share your values and identity. You'd fight for them or with them in a crisis. Enemies, those who threaten your way of life. They're not just competitors but existential threats. Example, imagine rival fantasy kingdoms. In Game of Thrones terms, the Starks and Lannisters don't just disagree, they're locked in existential combat over who gets to define the realm. Why is this distinction so intense? The friend-enemy distinction isn't about personal dislikes. It's public and collective, the group identity depends on it. Politics becomes real when this conflict sharpens, when we must decide who's in our camp and who isn't. Without conflict, politics loses its edge. For Schmitt, avoiding this reality leads to apathy or, worse, chaos. Decisionism, who gets to decide? Let's imagine a ship in a storm. Everyone's panicking, and someone must choose a course of action. That person, the captain, embodies sovereignty for Schmitt. In his words, the sovereign is he who decides on the exception. This means that in extreme cases, wars, revolutions, zombie apocalypses, someone has to call the shots even if it breaks the usual rules. Liberal democracies, with their love for procedures, can't handle such emergencies, Schmitt thought. They need someone who can act decisively. What's wrong with liberalism? Schmitt's critique of liberalism boils down to this: it tries to depoliticize politics. Liberalism loves neutrality. It wants debates, human rights, and peaceful coexistence, which sound great until a real enemy shows up. Conflict is inevitable. Ignoring the friend-enemy dynamic doesn't make it go away. It just creates hypocritical wars where one side claims to represent humanity while crushing its enemies. The risk of pacifism, Schmitt warned that a fully pacified world, where there's no war, would also kill off politics itself. You'd end up with a society obsessed with economics, culture, and entertainment but lacking the political tension that defines human existence. Schmitt's take on modern politics. For Schmitt, modern politics has lost its edge because it's focused on procedure, not substance. Endless debates don't resolve existential questions. It denies the reality of power struggles. Schmitt argued that pretending everyone can just get along ignores human nature. It's too comfortable with compromises. True politics requires risk, sacrifice, and the willingness to confront existential threats. What's the polemical point? Schmitt wasn't just writing abstract philosophy. He was throwing punches at liberalism and pluralism, challenging the idea that societies could function without defining clear friends and enemies. Hypocrisy in liberalism. When liberal democracies go to war, they don't admit it's about power or identity. Instead, they claim it's for universal values like freedom or humanity. Schmitt calls this out as a sneaky way of turning politics into moral crusades. Why does Schmitt matter today? Schmitt's ideas resonate with critics of liberal democracy on both the left and the right. Conservatives appreciate his emphasis on order and authority. Leftists see value in his critique of liberal neutrality and his focus on power dynamics. But liberal thinkers reject him as a dangerous thinker who romanticizes conflict and undercuts universal moral principles. Final takeaways. Carl Schmitt's political philosophy is like a sharp knife. It cuts through the fluff of liberal ideals and reveals the raw, messy core of politics, survival, power, and identity. He forces us to ask hard questions. Can societies truly function without defining clear friends and enemies? Is liberal democracy too fragile to handle existential crises? What does it mean to make decisions when the stakes are life and death? Schmitt's work is provocative, sometimes uncomfortable, but undeniably thought-provoking. Hannah Arendt. Let's dive into Hannah Arendt's philosophy as outlined in your lecture slides and turn it into an engaging and vibrant story. Buckle up for a journey through Arendt's ideas on freedom, action, and how politics can shape our lives. Who was Hannah Arendt? Imagine a philosopher trying to make sense of humanity after living through the biggest horrors of the 20th century: totalitarianism, a Holocaust, and the collapse of meaning in modern politics. That's Hannah Arendt, a thinker who wasn't afraid to wrestle with the big questions about freedom and political life. Her major works, like The Origins of Totalitarianism and The Human Condition, explore why politics isn't just about government, it's about how we exist and act together as humans. Freedom, the heartbeat of politics. Arendt starts with a bold claim: the raison d'être of politics is freedom. What does she mean? Politics isn't just about managing laws or keeping the economy running. At its core, politics is about action, people coming together to create, speak, and make something new. Freedom isn't just a nice side effect of politics, it's the whole point. What is freedom? For Arendt, freedom isn't the private autonomy of doing what you like, coughed John Stuart Mill. It's the act of stepping into the public realm, the space of appearance, and engaging with others through words and deeds. She draws on the Greek polis, think ancient Athens, to illustrate this. Private sphere, where you deal with life's necessities: eating, sleeping, Netflix binging. Public sphere, where freedom comes alive. It's where people interact, debate, and create shared meaning. Arendt sees this public space as a stage where we can reveal who we are through our actions. The catch? It's fragile and depends on people continuing to show up and participate. Action, the stage of freedom. Arendt's concept of action isn't just about doing stuff. It's about making an appearance, acting in front of others so your individuality shines. Unpredictability: once you act, you can't fully control what happens. It's like tossing a stone into a pond and watching the ripples. New beginnings: action is about starting something fresh and unexpected, like planting seeds for the future. Think of political action as a flash mob. It requires people to show up, interact, and create something surprising together. That's freedom in Arendt's eyes. The danger of forgetting politics. Why does Arendt think we're bad at understanding freedom? 2 culprits. Totalitarianism: totalitarian regimes, like Nazi Germany, crush the public realm. They make life predictable, orderly, and lonely, obliterating the space for political action and freedom. Philosophical tradition: Western philosophy has overemphasized internal freedom, like free will. Philosophers like Descartes, Locke, and Mill shifted freedom's focus to the private realm, reducing politics to a system of rules and governance. This forgetfulness leaves us with a shallow view of politics as something to avoid rather than embrace. Freedom versus liberation. Arendt distinguishes freedom from liberation. Liberation: getting rid of life's necessities, e.g., slavery or economic struggles. Freedom: what you do with that liberation. Once free, you need a public space where you can act meaningfully with others. In other words, freedom isn't just about being able to live, it's about living in a way that matters, visibly and collectively. Why action is miraculous. Arendt compares action to a miracle not because it's supernatural but because it disrupts the predictable flow of life. When people come together and act politically, they create something unprecedented. For Arendt, revolutions, when they work, capture this spirit of miraculous action. They rediscover and reclaim political freedom, though this treasure is often short-lived. Arendt versus Schmitt, a political showdown. Now let's pit Arendt against Carl Schmitt, whose ideas we've discussed earlier. Schmitt's politics: it's all about the friend-enemy distinction. Politics is a life-or-death struggle, driven by homogeneity and existential threats. Arendt's politics: it's about plurality and individuality. Politics isn't about deciding who's us and them, it's about creating a shared world where different voices can shine. While Schmitt sees politics as conflict and survival, Arendt views it as the stage for freedom and collaboration. Where Schmitt emphasizes sovereignty and control, Arendt argues that true politics thrives on unpredictability and non-sovereignty. Key takeaways for your exam. Freedom is the core of politics. Politics exists for the sake of freedom, not governance or order. Action is freedom. Freedom happens when people act together in the public sphere, revealing themselves and starting something new. The fragility of politics: political life depends on the active participation of individuals. It can easily be lost to authoritarianism or complacency. Critique of modernity, totalitarianism, and the philosophical tradition have distorted our understanding of politics, turning it into a tool of control rather than a space for freedom. Arendt versus Schmitt. Arendt's politics is about collective action and plurality, contrasting sharply with Schmitt's focus on conflict and homogeneity. In Arendt's words, men are free as long as they act. Politics, for Arendt, is the art of acting together to shape the world, and that's where our humanity truly shines. So as you prepare for your exam, channel your inner Arendt and imagine the stage of the public realm. What role will you play?
John Rawls. Let's embark on a journey into the land of John Rawls and his blockbuster political theory, A Theory of Justice. This philosophical adventure is sprinkled with analogies, laughs, and a hefty dose of justice. Who was John Rawls? Picture this, it's the mid-20th century, and the world is grappling with the Cold War, civil rights movements, and university revolts. Amid all this chaos, a Harvard philosophy professor, John Rawls, 1921 to 2002, decides to drop A Theory of Justice, 1971, a book so influential it reshaped political philosophy like a new season of The Crown reshapes royal gossip. The big idea, justice is fairness. Think of society as a pie. Rawls asks, who gets what slice, and why? He's not about simply dividing it equally or letting the strongest grab the biggest slice. Instead, Rawls wants to figure out the fairest way to share the pie so that even the smallest slice feels like it's part of a delicious, just dessert. Key goals of Rawls's theory. Develop principles for distributing society's benefits and burdens fairly. Balance freedom, equality, and cooperation without letting greed, bias, or luck ruin the party. Provide a foundation for justice that everyone can accept, regardless of personal beliefs. Rawls's secret sauce, the original position and veil of ignorance. Let's start with Rawls's thought experiment, the original position. Imagine a group of people designing the rules for society, but with a twist, they're behind a veil of ignorance. What's the veil of ignorance? It's like amnesia, but fairer. You don't know your social class, gender, race, or wealth. Your talents, intelligence, or personality. Your goals, religion, or political views. Basically, you're designing society's rules as if you could be anyone in that society. This ensures impartiality because no one can rig the rules in their favor. It's like choosing a board game without knowing if you'll play as the banker or the jailbird. What principles would you pick? If you're in the original position, you'd likely choose two key principles to make sure you're not stuck on the losing end of life's lotteries. 1. Equal basic liberties. Everyone gets equal rights and freedoms, freedom of speech, political participation, and so on. These liberties are sacred and can't be traded away, not even for more pie. 2. The difference principle. Here's where things get spicy. Rawls says inequalities, like wealth or power, are okay if, and only if, they benefit the least advantaged members of society. Imagine a policy that lets billionaires exist, but only if their taxes fund schools, healthcare, and opportunities for the poorest. Rawls's difference principle is about maximizing the floor, not just the ceiling. The justice framework. Rawls's system works like a multi-level cake. First layer, equal liberties, the foundation. Everyone has the same rights, no exceptions. Second layer, fair equality of opportunity. Everyone gets the same chance to succeed, e.g. quality education for all. Top layer, the difference principle. Let's allow inequality, but only if it makes life better for those at the bottom. Why these principles? Rawls gives two arguments. Instrumental argument, the rational choice. Behind the veil of ignorance, you'd choose principles that minimize your risks. Why? Because you might end up as the poorest or weakest person. So, the Maximin strategy, maximize the minimum, makes sense. Pick rules that improve the worst-off scenario. Moral argument, fairness. Life is full of lotteries, social, your class, family wealth, and natural, your talents, intelligence. Rawls argues that no one deserves their starting position, so the rules shouldn't reward lucky breaks. Instead, justice demands compensating for these arbitrary factors. Rawls versus alternative theories. Utilitarianism, greatest good for the greatest number sounds nice, but it can sacrifice individual rights. Rawls rejects it because it ignores the separateness of persons. Meritocracy sounds fair at first, but it rewards natural talents, which are as random as a coin toss. Libertarianism, nope. It lets inequalities run wild without helping the less fortunate. Applications, Rawls's just society. Rawls imagines a property-owning democracy, where wealth is dispersed, no megabillionaires hoarding resources. Opportunities are equalized, education and healthcare are publicly funded. Inheritance is taxed heavily, because fairness isn't hereditary. Think of it as monopoly, but with fewer landlords and more free parking. What's the deal with justice as fairness? It's not a utopia. Rawls knows its ideal theory, a blueprint for a perfect society. It doesn't answer everyday issues like punishment or resistance. Instead, it provides a framework to evaluate policies and institutions. It's about creating a system where cooperation benefits everyone over time. Responses to Rawls. Not everyone loves Rawls. Here's why. Global justice. His theory is focused on single societies. What about global inequalities? Future generations, can his principles handle climate change and sustainability? Communitarianism. Critics argue Rawls ignores the importance of shared cultural values. Decolonialism. Does Rawls account for historical injustices like colonialism? Despite these critiques, Rawls's work remains a cornerstone of modern political philosophy, a lighthouse guiding us toward fairness. Key takeaways for your exam. Justice is impartial. Use the veil of ignorance to decide what's fair. 2 principles of justice, equal liberties and the difference principle ensure fairness. Rawls's focus, it's on society's basic structure, the institutions that shape our lives. Why fairness matters. Life's lotteries are random, so justice compensates for these inequalities. Rawls versus the world. His ideas contrast sharply with utilitarianism, libertarianism, and meritocracy. Rawls's philosophy isn't just an abstract theory. It's a toolkit for building a society that feels fair, no matter where you stand. So as you prep for your exam, think of Rawls as the architect of a moral mansion, with fairness as its foundation and cooperation as its bricks. Jürgen Habermas. Let's jump into the fascinating world of Jürgen Habermas, where democracy is like a never-ending dinner party, civil disobedience is the spicy dish on the menu, and everything revolves around communication. Habermas doesn't just want us to talk, he wants us to talk better, fairer, and smarter. So, let's dive in with humor and clarity. Who is Jürgen Habermas? Imagine a philosopher with a megaphone, shouting, "Let's talk it out." That's Habermas, 1929, present, a German thinker obsessed with the power of communication. His big idea? Deliberative democracy. The idea that democracy should be a giant, open, rational conversation, where decisions aren't dictated by power but emerge from dialogue. Deliberative democracy, a dialogue of equals. For Habermas, democracy isn't just about voting, it's about reasoning together. He calls this communicative rationality, a fancy way of saying that society works best when we deliberate freely and equally in a public sphere. How does it work? The public sphere. Imagine an open marketplace of ideas where people debate, discuss, and deliberate. This isn't just about Twitter fights, it's thoughtful, reasoned discussion. Institutions, parliamentary systems and democratic decision-making are where this dialogue takes concrete form. Think of it as turning conversation into action. The will of the people. Habermas doesn't believe in a fixed will of the people. Instead, he says it's something we create through inclusive and rational dialogue. Why is this radical? Habermas rejects 2 traditional views. Aggregated preferences. democracy isn't about tallying up everyone's pre-existing opinions. Instead, dialogue can transform preferences into more rational ones. Homogeneity. There's no mystical pre-political identity or unified people. Instead, democracy thrives on diversity and pluralism. Civil disobedience, the litmus test for democracy. Now, let's talk about the troublemakers, civil disobedience. Is it democratic? Or is it just causing chaos? For Habermas, civil disobedience is a crucial part of democracy, a way to test its health. What is civil disobedience? Think of civil disobedience as the rebel sibling of lawful protest. It breaks the law, but does so peacefully. It appeals to the public, aiming to persuade rather than overthrow. It respects the system, even while challenging specific laws or decisions. Why is it controversial? Critics say civil disobedience breaks the law, undermining democracy's foundation. Disturbs the peace. They call disobedient citizens axes to democracy. Habermas's rebuttal? These critics are thinking in black and white. Civil disobedience isn't anarchy, it's a necessary, nuanced expression of democratic citizenship. The justification for civil disobedience. Habermas sees civil disobedience as democracy's self-correcting mechanism. Here's why. 1. Failing representation. Sometimes, the parliamentary system falters, like a glitch in democracy's operating system. If the government can't represent the people's will on crucial issues, citizens must step in to care for democracy's legitimacy. Example, nuclear weapons. Habermas asks, can a simple majority really justify decisions with irreversible, catastrophic risks? Imagine deciding to launch nukes based on a coin toss, clearly not enough. 2. State of exception. Civil disobedience responds to situations where the usual rules don't work. But it's not a free pass for every protester. Habermas warns that disobedience must be scrupulously examined to avoid elitist or narcissistic impulses. Democracy is a self-doubting machine. For Habermas, democracy isn't perfect, it's always questioning itself. He calls this non-institutionalized distrust. Why? Because humans are fallible, and even democratic systems can produce unjust laws. Civil disobedience is like a whistleblower for democracy, reminding it to live up to its ideals. Applications and challenges. Civil disobedience isn't just an abstract theory, it's a practical tool. But it's not without limits. Nonviolence is key, it's about persuasion, not coercion. No private morality. You can't break laws just because of personal beliefs. Disobedience must appeal to public values. Exceptional, not routine, it's for when democracy's usual checks and balances break down. Habermas versus authoritarian legalism. Habermas rails against what he calls authoritarian legalism, the idea that the law is sacrosanct, no matter what. He argues that rigidly enforcing laws without questioning their legitimacy ignores the human substance of democracy. Laws aren't just rules, they're the product of our collective dialogue, and they must remain open to critique. Deliberative democracy versus other models. Traditional democracy often assumes fixed preferences and majoritarian rule. Republicanism leans on the idea of a unified common good. Deliberative democracy, Habermas focuses on dialogue, diversity, and evolving preferences. Habermas's approach offers a middle ground. It respects the rule of law but keeps it flexible, responsive, and tied to public reasoning. Key takeaways for your exam. Deliberative democracy. Democracy is an ongoing conversation, not just elections or laws. Civil disobedience. It's a democratic act when it appeals to public values and aims to correct systemic failures. The public sphere, a space for rational debate, is essential for legitimate governance. Critique of authoritarian legalism. Laws must be open to critique, blind obedience undermines democracy. Habermas's vision. Democracy is a self-doubting, self-correcting system that thrives on communication and pluralism. In Habermas's words, Every constitutional democracy that is sure of itself considers civil disobedience as a normalized, because necessary, component of its political culture. In other words, democracy isn't afraid of a little mess. Civil disobedience is like a stress test for the system. It reveals its strength and helps it grow stronger. So as you prepare for your exam, channel your inner Habermas and ask yourself, how can we talk better, think better, and build a fairer world together?
Iris Young. Let's dive into Iris Marion Young and her critique of universal citizenship. Think of it as a quest to make democracy as inclusive and equitable as your favorite potluck dinner, where everyone's dish gets appreciated, even that one weird casserole. Buckle up, because we're blending humor with Young's revolutionary ideas on democracy, justice, and oppression. Who was Iris Marion Young? Young, 1949 to 2006, was a political theorist who turned her passion for justice into a vibrant academic career. A professor at the University of Chicago, she wrote extensively about social inequality, oppression, and democracy. Her works, like Justice and the Politics of Difference, 1990, remain cornerstones for understanding how society can address persistent injustices. Young wasn't interested in abstract, utopian theories. She wanted to explore the real-world experiences of injustice and help activists and movements articulate their struggles. If philosophers are the architects of justice, Young was the contractor making sure the blueprint worked for everyone. Setting the stage, universal citizenship. Young's essay, Polity and Group Difference, a critique of the ideal of universal citizenship, 1989, critiques the seemingly noble ideal of universal citizenship, the idea that democracy should treat everyone equally, regardless of differences. Sounds great, right? Well, Young says, not so fast. The myth of the general standpoint. Young argues that universal citizenship is based on three myths. Citizenship for everyone, status. Universal citizenship promises inclusion but often comes with strings attached. Historically excluded groups, e.g., women, racial minorities, may get formal rights but are still treated as second-class citizens. Example: women may vote but face systemic challenges like unequal pay or inadequate maternity leave. Sameness versus difference. The ideal of sameness assumes we can transcend differences, race, gender, class, in the public realm. But Young argues that pretending to be the same ignores real, lived experiences. Impartiality is a myth. Your life experiences shape your views, and privileged groups often dominate public discussions under the guise of neutrality. Equal treatment. Equal treatment sounds fair but can reinforce inequalities. If the system is designed for the privileged, treating everyone equally upholds systemic barriers for marginalized groups. Think of wheelchair users in a building with no ramps. Treating everyone the same, expecting them to use stairs, ignores their distinct needs. Equality versus equal treatment. Here's the kicker: treating everyone equally doesn't automatically result in fairness. Why? Because historical injustices and structural inequalities persist. Example 1, disability and accessibility. Society's infrastructure assumes normal bodies, disadvantaging people with disabilities. Fixing this requires recognizing and accommodating differences, not ignoring them. Example 2. Gender and institutions. Schools and workplaces often fail to accommodate the realities of menstruation, pregnancy, and breastfeeding, subtly sidelining women. Young's solution: move beyond formal equality and embrace differentiated citizenship, where groups receive recognition and rights tailored to their specific needs. The 5 faces of oppression. Young identifies 5 interconnected ways oppression operates. Think of oppression as a bad roommate who leaves messes everywhere but denies doing so. Exploitation. People's labor or energy benefits others disproportionately. Example: sweatshop workers or gendered labor like caregiving. Marginalization. Exclusion from meaningful participation in society. Example: elderly people, ethnic minorities, or disabled individuals who face barriers to employment. Powerlessness. Lack of authority or influence over one's life and society. Example, low-wage workers stuck in jobs with no upward mobility. Cultural imperialism. Dominant culture defines norms and stereotypes marginalized groups. Example, native cultures being erased or stereotyped as exotic. Violence. Systemic vulnerability to harm or intimidation, simply because of one's identity. Example, hate crimes, bullying, or domestic violence targeted at specific groups. Structural oppression. Unlike traditional oppression, where a tyrant oppresses their subjects, structural oppression is baked into society's systems, habits, and norms. It's not always intentional, it's just how things are. Example, a business hires based on cultural fit, which subtly excludes people who don't look, sound, or act like the dominant group. Jung's brilliance lies in naming this invisible oppression and showing how even well-meaning people contribute to it without realizing. Differentiated citizenship, embracing group difference. Jung proposes differentiated citizenship as a way to move beyond the shortcomings of universal citizenship. What it means. Groups, e.g., women, racial minorities, disabled people, get recognition and rights that reflect their unique experiences and needs. Example, indigenous groups receiving land rights or LGBTQ+ communities having anti-discrimination protections. Why it's important. Differentiated citizenship doesn't aim to compensate for inferiority, but celebrates the specificity and diversity of human experiences. Participatory democracy, a new way of doing politics. Jung envisions a communicative democracy where diverse voices aren't just heard but actively shape decisions. Unlike deliberative democracy, a la Habermas, Jung's model emphasizes. Beyond rationality, it's not just about logical arguments but also emotions, storytelling, and lived experiences. No forced consensus, instead of aiming for universal agreement, focus on dialogue and mutual respect. Power to the marginalized, create spaces where historically excluded groups can lead the conversation. Comparing Jung to other thinkers. Schmitt. Jung rejects Schmitt's friend-enemy binary, arguing for inclusion over division. Arendt. While Arendt values the public realm, Jung highlights how it often excludes marginalized groups. Rawls. Jung critiques Rawls's ideal of impartiality, saying it ignores structural inequalities. Habermas. Unlike Habermas, Jung emphasizes difference and distrusts consensus as a goal. Key takeaways for your exam. Universal citizenship's flaw, it pretends differences don't exist, reinforcing privilege. Structural oppression, oppression is systemic, embedded in everyday practices and norms. Differentiated citizenship, recognizing group differences is key to genuine equality. 5 faces of oppression, exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence. Participatory democracy, democracy must include diverse voices and value lived experiences. In Jung's words, the problem is not the attributes individual persons have or do not have. The problem, rather, is the lack of fit between individuals and society's dominant norms and practices. In other words, if society's playing field isn't level, pretending it is only makes things worse. Jung's vision is about building a democracy where everyone has a seat at the table, and no one has to hide who they are to belong. Arash Abizadeh. Let's take a deep dive into Arash Abizadeh and the boundary problem in democratic theory, where we ask one of the most profound, and, frankly, mind-bending, questions of democracy: who gets to be part of the people? It's like hosting a party and realizing no one knows who made the guest list, or who even owns the house. Let's unpack this lecture with humor and clarity so you're prepped for any exam curveballs. What is the boundary problem? Democracy means rule by the people, demos, right? But wait, who counts as the people? That's the boundary problem. It's like deciding who gets a say in planning the dinner menu but not knowing if the guests in the next room should vote, too. The catch-22 of democracy. Popular sovereignty. Democracy rests on the idea that the will of the people legitimizes political decisions. Membership paradox. But to decide democratically who the people are, you'd already need to know who the people are. How do you hold a vote about who gets to vote? Infinite regress alert. If every democratic decision about boundaries requires a prior democratic decision, we're caught in an infinite loop, like a snake eating its own tail. What's at stake? The boundary problem isn't just theoretical, it's central to real-world issues like borders. Who decides who gets to cross or stay? Membership. Who gets to be a citizen? Secession. Should regions like Scotland or Catalonia get to break away? Global justice. How do we include the interests of future generations or non-human constituencies, like the environment? Flashback. Social contract theories. Let's rewind to the old-school thinkers. Hobbes. The state is a leviathan. A giant agreement to stop chaos, but he's silent on who counts as us. Locke. People consent to the state to protect property and rights, but who decides who consents? Rousseau. Popular sovereignty is key, but he assumes the people is already defined. Schmitt. Democracy requires a clear boundary between us, friends, and them, enemies. But how do we draw the line? None of these thinkers directly solve the boundary problem, though they dance around it like a philosophical conga line. Enter Abizadeh, rethinking the demos. Abizadeh steps into this mess with a fresh approach. The unbounded demos thesis, the demos, the people, isn't a fixed, pre-political entity. Instead, it's a flexible, open-ended idea, a regulative principle that helps us evaluate how democratic a system really is. All subjective principle, borders and political decisions don't just affect citizens, they also affect outsiders, like migrants. Therefore, anyone subjected to power should have a say in how it's exercised. Borders, the elephant in the room. Abizadeh zeroes in on borders as a key democratic challenge. Borders coerce people, even non-citizens, e.g., migrants, refugees, are subjected to the coercive power of borders. Democratic legitimacy. For borders to be legitimate, they must be justified to everyone they affect, not just the citizens inside them. Practical implication. Foreigners should have a say in shaping border policies, because those policies affect their lives too. It's like building a wall around your house and demanding your neighbor pay for it, but they never got a vote on the wall in the first place. Democratic responses to the boundary problem. Here are some ways thinkers try to tackle the question of, who are the people? Cosmopolitanism. Everyone, everywhere is part of humanity. Borders are arbitrary, and a world state would be the most democratic solution. Critique. Sounds nice, but it feels unrealistic and imposes global constraints on local democracies. Nationalism. The demos is a pre-political nation tied by culture, ethnicity, or history. Critique. Pre-political nations are often myths, and nationalism can exclude minorities and outsiders. Historicism. Start with the communities and borders we already have and make them work. Critique. This feels pragmatic but doesn't address the injustices of arbitrary or historical boundaries. The democratic gap. Abizadeh highlights the legitimation gap in existing borders. Borders are a major way political power is exercised, but they're rarely justified to everyone they affect. What does democracy require? Participation. Those subjected to power, citizens and non-citizens, must have a say. Cosmopolitan democratic institutions. We need new systems to address border issues democratically, beyond nation-states. Big takeaways from Abizadeh. Democracy's core value, personal autonomy. People should have a say in decisions that affect their freedom. Rethinking borders. Borders aren't just lines on a map. They're mechanisms of coercion that must be democratically justified. Unbounded demos. The demos isn't a fixed group, it's an open, evolving idea based on who is affected by decisions. Key questions for reflection. Can we ever fully democratize borders, or are they inherently exclusionary? Does democracy require global participation for legitimacy? How can we balance the autonomy of existing states with the rights of non-members? Funny analogy, democracy's pizza party. Imagine democracy as a pizza party. The demos is the guest list. But who decides who gets invited? If you're standing outside smelling the pizza, don't you deserve a say in the toppings? Abizadeh argues that anyone affected by the party, even outsiders, should get a vote because the pizza aroma, power, doesn't stop at the door. For your exam. Boundary problem, who counts as the people in democracy? Abizadeh's solution, the demos should be unbounded, based on who is subjected to power. Key principle, borders must be democratically justified to both insiders and outsiders. Critiques, practical challenges to cosmopolitanism and unbounded democracy. Abizadeh flips the boundary problem on its head, asking us to rethink democracy as a global, participatory process. It's ambitious, idealistic, and, in its way, deliciously radical, like debating pineapple on pizza with everyone at the party.